Good evening, everyone. Some people are still coming in from the waiting room, but we're going to get started. Welcome to A Little Sight Music. If you haven't already guessed, that's in reference to the musical A Little Night Music, for which Stephen Sondheim, the late Stephen Sondheim, wrote the music and lyrics. It took me a little longer than it should have to figure out a good word, an appropriate word for our project that rhymes with night. Sight. Okay, well, I got there eventually. So this photo here shows Sondheim at the piano, along with composer Leonard Bernstein and the cast of West Side Story in 1957. And while tonight's program was inspired by Sondheim and is in tribute to him, it's really about a celebration of the LGBT community's contributions to the field of music as a whole, and where in New York City those contributions took place. I'm by no means a music expert or an expert on any one person featured tonight, but like all or most of us, I'm sure music is an important part of my life, and even my ethnic background being both Jewish and Colombian. So I'm excited to share these sights with you tonight. And on that note, the artists featured tonight are almost all white or African American. So if you know of queer, Asian, or Latino people, for example, who should be included, please comment in the chat or send us an email at info@nyclgbtsites.org. We'd really love to get more representation in the field of music and throughout the website. One of the most prominent features of our project is our interactive website, which now features over 385 historic LGBT sites in all 5 boroughs, ranging from the 17th century to the year 2000. We use these color-coded pins to illustrate the kinds of sites we're documenting, and you'll see these colors appear throughout tonight's talk. The map also includes a filter on the left-hand side with the 5 categories you see here. In this example, I've opened up the cultural significance category and selected the music tag. The sites are predominantly in Manhattan at the moment. So again, if you have suggestions for more sites in the other boroughs, we'd love to know. And we're also doing our own outreach as well. On the upper right-hand corner of the website is a drop-down menu. It's something to point out because I'm not sure that many people know about it, and it's a really useful resource. There are a number of pages on the website that you can visit. The red arrow here points to the sites page. So if you click on that, you're taken to our sites landing page, where you'll find thumbnail views of all the historic sites on our website. It's a great way to peruse what we have, and you can order the list alphabetically by name or by borough. Now I'm going to go through a range of music-related sites, starting with jazz and blues, which feels appropriate given the sheer importance of both genres to the development of American music, such as rock and roll, and also skiffle music, which became really popular in England during the 1950s and was taken up by some aspiring musicians in Liverpool who later called themselves the Beatles. So a lot of influence and inspiration coming from African-American music. Singer and actress Ethel Waters lived in a 7-room apartment at 580 South St. Nicholas Avenue in Harlem's Sugar Hill section from at least 1925 to 1927. This building was one of the neighborhood's most prestigious addresses for prominent African-Americans around this time. And in fact, many leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance gathered in a literary salon across the hall from Waters. Waters had moved to Harlem in 1919 and performed as a blues singer in venues there, such as the Lafayette Theater, which unfortunately is no longer standing, and the Lincoln Theater, which has had its facade altered. Some of her hit songs that she recorded while living in this apartment were Dinah, I Found a New Baby, and Am I Blue? She also performed with jazz great Duke Ellington at the Cotton Club, a whites-only nightclub in Harlem, debuting her rendition of Stormy Weather there in 1933. I debated including some sound clips tonight of music mentioned throughout, but that would just be too complicated. Most of this can be found on YouTube or other music-related sites. Waters was a groundbreaking performer who achieved stardom in theater, radio, movies, and television in the racially segregated Jim Crow era. She made her Broadway debut in Africana in 1927, which caught the attention of lyricist Irving Berlin, who would later cast her as the only major Black performer in As Thousands Cheer, a huge Broadway hit in 1933. And you can see some of the language on this Africana poster kind of hints at what she had to deal with in those early years. In the early 1920s, Waters was well known in Harlem's lesbian circles and lived with her girlfriend, dancer Ethel Williams. As her fame grew, particularly when she found success in Hollywood, she never publicly acknowledged her homosexuality, which was typical of the time and in many cases still today with actors, and certainly an actor of color. Alberta Hunter, like Ethel Waters, was also a star blues singer whose career took off in the 1920s. She moved to New York City in 1923, already an established talent with the hit song Downhearted Blues, which she co-wrote a year earlier. In 1927, she bought apartment 53 in this building at 133 West 138th Street, which was home to a number of Black entertainers. Fortunately, the New York Public Library has access to a number of digitized African-American newspapers, and we were able to look through them and see articles that indicated this was Hunter's permanent address until at least 1945. She was also often touring in Europe during this time, citing better opportunities for Black performers there than in the United States. Hunter, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Gladys Bentley, who's not pictured, and as I just mentioned, Ethel Waters, were among a group of lesbian and bisexual blues singers of the time. Journalist Lisa Hicks notes that, quote, blues music in the 1920s was so far under the radar of mainstream America that female blues singers could get away with occasionally expressing their unconventional desires. That said, they all felt obligated to produce song after song about loving and losing men. She goes on to write that, quote, in jazz age speakeasies, dive bars, and private parties, blues singers had the freedom to explore alternative sexuality, and on a rare occasion, they even expressed it in song. Hunter was in an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman named Lottie Tyler for many years, and they even sometimes traveled together. However, Hunter remained closeted her entire life. In the book, Who's Who in Gay and Lesbian History, Stephen Bourne writes that Hunter sang mostly about anguished love affairs, which resonated with gay audiences. In her later years, Hunter made a comeback with her singing career at 82 years old, with her popular performances at the Cookery in Greenwich Village that lasted shortly before her death in 1984. The next generation of music artists in Harlem includes the great jazz composer and arranger Billy Strayhorn and his partner, jazz pianist and composer Aaron Bridgers, who moved to a ground floor apartment in this row house at 315 Convent Avenue in 1939. Strayhorn had a highly successful collaboration with Duke Ellington from the time Strayhorn was 23 years old until his untimely death, some 3 decades later in 1967. While living on Convent Avenue, Strayhorn wrote the songs Lush Life, Lotus Blossom, and Take the A Train. And as I like to say, you can actually take the A Train to the 145th Street station and walk a couple blocks over to the house where he wrote it. The house is a private residence, so just admire from the street. Strayhorn was also wrote most of the music for the musicals Beggar's Holiday and Jump for Joy. Aaron Bridgers studied classical piano, but later switched to jazz after hearing the music of famed jazz pianist Art Tatum, who would become his teacher. In 1948, Bridgers left for Paris for his first professional engagement as a pianist, and in 1961 appeared in the movie Paris Blues. Strayhorn lived in the Convent Avenue apartment until 1950. He was one of the rare men in the jazz world to be openly gay. A friend of his once said that, quote, the most amazing thing of all about Billy Strayhorn to me was that he had the strength to make an extraordinary decision. That is, the decision not to hide the fact that he was homosexual. And he did this in the 1940s, when nobody but nobody did that. And Strayhorn and Bridgers are in the center, the two people at center. And here you see Bridgers and Strayhorn pictured with jazz singer Billie Holiday at Manhattan's Cafe Society Uptown. Billie Holiday and also gospel star Sister Rosetta Tharpe were two queer Black artists who performed at Cafe Society's downtown location in Greenwich Village in the basement space of 1 Sheridan Square, which is actually around the corner from the Stonewall Inn. Cafe Society opened in 1938, and although it was billed as New York City's first racially integrated club, at least one venue, Small's Paradise in Harlem, which opened in 1925, appears to have preceded it. Billie Holiday, who was then a relatively unknown young singer, was the opening performer at Cafe Society. She played there for 9 months, and it's where she debuted the anti-lynching song Strange Fruit. The club closed in 1950. On our website, you'll find more LGBT history for this building, including its time as Charles Ludlam's ridiculous theatrical company. And we do have plans to add a Billie Holiday residence to the website. So now we'll look at 3 major performance halls that featured a wide range of LGBT performance artists, with an emphasis tonight on those connected to music. Of these 3 historic sites, Carnegie Hall at the corner of 7th Avenue and 57th Street was the first to open, and this was in 1891. A few years later, the studio tower apartments were built on top of the hall and served this purpose until the last residents were evicted in 2010. And you can see that in the background there, the studio towers. Not the very far background, but. So Carnegie Hall's connection to LGBT history starts at the very beginning with a music festival that officially opened the hall to performances and featured the world-renowned composer Peter Tchaikovsky, a gay man who conducted several of his own works at the festival. And here's an opening night ticket and a sketch of that opening night performance. Few people are as closely associated with the hall as Leonard Bernstein, who appeared more than 430 times between 1943 and 1990 as a conductor, a pianist, a composer, and an educator. On our website, we also include a long list of major LGBT composers, musicians, and singers who have performed here, such as Benjamin Britten and Isadora Duncan. And in 1981, the New York City Gay Men's Chorus made their Carnegie Hall debut. One of the longest term residents of Studio Tower was Don Shirley, a gay classical and jazz pianist and composer who lived here from 1956 until his eviction in 2010, first in an 8th floor apartment and then apartment 130 on the 13th floor. His grand piano had to be removed by crane, which must have been quite a sight. Besides Leonard Bernstein, who lived in a 9th floor apartment for a time here, Shirley was the only studio tenant to perform solo concerts at Carnegie Hall. He became more widely known after the release of the 2018 movie Green Book, which chronicled one of his US concert tours in the 1960s, and where he was portrayed by actor Mahershala Ali. The Apollo Theater on 125th Street in Harlem opened in 1914, around the time that African Americans began migrating to the neighborhood in large numbers. While the Apollo was relatively late in bringing on Black entertainers, they became the rule rather than the exception at the Apollo, beginning in 1932. During its heyday from the 1930s to the 1970s, nearly every important Black entertainer played here, including many LGBT stars. Through the 1950s, the Apollo was one of the rare major theaters in the United States to feature African American performers. In the realm of music, LGBT stars such as Bessie Smith, Alberta Hunter, Johnny Mathis, Ethel Waters, Big Mama Thornton, Luther Vandross, and James Cleveland, among many others, performed here. Some entertainers, such as Little Richard and Billie Holiday, also have plaques on the sidewalk in front of the theater. And these are just a couple of the ones that we took. In the 1960s, the Apollo was also home to the popular Jewelbox Revue, America's first traveling troupe of gender impersonators, a term that was used then, although at least some members might have defined themselves as transgender if they were performing today. The group was especially notable for its racially integrated cast. Lincoln Center on the Upper West Side was the last of these performance halls to open. It includes 3 main buildings that surround the plaza and fountain: the Metropolitan Opera House, which we're looking straight on at, the New York State Theater, we see just a bit of at the left, and Philharmonic Hall on the right. In 1962, the Philharmonic, which is now David Geffen Hall, was the first to open. Like Carnegie Hall, its ties to the LGBT community started at the beginning. In this case, Leonard Bernstein conducting the inaugural concert, which included a new piece by the gay composer Aaron Copeland. And I'm using the word gay in front of the word composer so that you know when I'm calling out someone from the LGBT community. In 1966, the Metropolitan Opera House opened with yet another LGBT association, that of the world premiere of gay composer Samuel Barber's Antony and Cleopatra, in a controversial production by the gay librettist Franco Zeffirelli, who also directed and designed the lavish sets and costumes. Two other gay associations were Thomas Chippers, who conducted the opera, and Alvin Ailey, who choreographed it. The New York State Theater, which opened in 1964 and is now called the David Koch Theater, was designed by gay architect Philip Johnson as the home of the New York City Ballet. From 1966 to 2010, the State Theater was home to the New York City Opera, which had previously been at City Center, another LGBT site we've mapped. Several gay composers, such as Benjamin Britten and Virgil Thompson, were associated with opera productions at the State Theater. In 1995, the show Harvey Milk had, according to the New York Times, probably, quote, the first homosexual love scenes in an opera house. So now we'll look at some sites associated with opera and classical music. Or some residences, I should say. So first we're heading over to Staten Island, which was the longtime home of opera singer Graham Marr and his partner, landscape painter Norman Robert Morrison. Marr bought this mid-19th century house, which he renamed Marr Lodge, in 1925, and lived there until his death in 1961. Morrison continued to live there until 1968. The site is remarkable in that it provides us with an early known example of a gay couple living together on Staten Island, though it is not the first. Alice Austen and Gertrude Tate have so far claimed that title. Perhaps there's a couple earlier than that, we'll see. Marr toured the world as an opera singer beginning in 1909, returning to the US 4 years later to sing with most of the major opera companies of the day in various cities. In New York, he performed at the Brooklyn Academy of Music and the Manhattan Opera Company Theater on 34th Street. Shifting back to Manhattan and to the Upper West Side, and in fact right next to Lincoln Center, is the Hotel Empire, where composer Aaron Copeland lived from 1936 to 1947, the height of his illustrious career. The residence was a modest 10th floor studio furnished with a piano, of course. He also rented and worked in a nearby loft on 63rd Street that would later be demolished for the construction of Lincoln Center. Aaron Copeland's entry was the first one I wrote for the website several years ago. I grew up listening to his music and was absolutely floored to learn that he was born and raised in Brooklyn. I hadn't pictured a dense urban environment as the place where Copeland was from when I listened to pieces that spoke to the wide open spaces of the American landscape, like Appalachian Spring or Fanfare for the Common Man, both of which he wrote while living at the Hotel Empire. Copeland became known as the Dean of American Music and was one of the most influential and popular figures of 20th century classical music. Copeland co-founded the American Music Center in 1939, and its collection of music scores was donated to the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts in 2001, and that library is actually part of Lincoln Center. According to biographer Howard Pollock, Copeland was one of the few composers of his stature to live openly and travel with his lovers, who tended to be younger male artists. His most enduring relationship was with photographer Victor Kraft, who would come and go in Copeland's life. You can see that Kraft took this portrait of Copeland, and the letter on the left is just a fun find. It's a letterhead from the Hotel Empire with Copeland's handwriting. There's a lot of these available at the Library of Congress. Copeland lived the last 30 years of his life in Cortland, New York, and that house was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2008 because of its association with Copeland. Copeland was a mentor to many composers, several of whom were gay, including Leonard Bernstein in the late 1930s and 1940s, and the two were briefly lovers. We mapped the Dakota Apartments on 72nd Street and Central Park West as one of Bernstein's New York residences, but tonight I'm featuring the Osborne Apartments at the corner of 57th Street and 7th Avenue. And if that sounds familiar, it's because I just mentioned that corner earlier for Carnegie Hall, which is located catty-corner from the Osborne. You really couldn't ask for a better commute unless you work from home. In 1943, Bernstein conducted a matinee last minute, which was heard nationwide on the radio, making him an immediate musical sensation. Bernstein lived in apartment 4B here from 1951 until about 1960, moving here from Studio Tower at Carnegie Hall. And we believe that the photo on the right is at the Osborne. The historic details in this apartment are just beautiful. There are so many photos of this available online. You have to look at, it's just the details. I can't stop, clearly I can't stop talking about it. But you can see Carnegie Hall in the back of that, in the back window there. So a great view as well. The actress Jessica Chastain bought the apartment in 2015 for about $5 million. So no big deal. Bernstein's wife, whom he married in 1951 and lived with at the Osborne, knew that her husband was gay, but wanted to marry him anyway. It had been suggested that conductor Dmitri Mitropoulos, also gay, told Bernstein that if he wished to become the music director of a prestigious orchestra, he should marry. The gay playwright Arthur Lawrence once noted that Bernstein was, quote, a gay man who got married. He wasn't conflicted about it at all. He was just gay. While Bernstein had a loving relationship with his wife and children, he continued to have affairs with young men. And so now Bernstein will lead us into the great Broadway musicals. Bernstein was also a successful composer for a number of hit Broadway musicals, several of which were completed while he lived at the Osborne, including On the Town and Candide at the Martin Beck Theater, which is now the Al Hirschfeld Theater. And you'll notice that the On the Town poster mentions the Adelphi Theater, which is where the show premiered before moving to the Martin Beck. The Adelphi was demolished, so for our website, we note On the Town as being at the Martin Beck. Bernstein also wrote the music for Wonderful Town and West Side Story at the Winter Garden Theater. His music for West Side Story was paired with the lyrics of a young Stephen Sondheim, who began his legendary association with musical theater with this 1957 production. Actually, all of the major members of the creative team for this one were gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Most of the musicals I'll mention tonight have a strong queer influence, although for the sake of time, I'll be focusing on composers. A couple of years ago, we reached out to Stephen Sondheim to ask his permission to add his longtime Manhattan residence at 246 East 49th Street to our website, where he lived with his husband. He responded by thanking us for the inclusion, but asked that we wait to add his home until he, in his words, passed on to better worlds. So we're in the process of researching that site to highlight his life and his transformative contributions to the American musical. But in the meantime, we have his work included in many Broadway theater entries. Sondheim grew up in the San Remo apartments on Central Park West and had a New York City residence somewhere between 49th Street and 82nd Street his entire life. In 1960, he moved into the 49th Street house and lived there until his death last year, an incredible 61 years in the same house. He fell in love with the space immediately and called it the house that Gypsy built, in reference to the hit 1959 Broadway musical Gypsy that premiered at the Broadway Theater and for which he wrote the lyrics. Before moving here, he had been living in a small apartment on West 80th Street where after 10 o'clock at night, his downstairs neighbor would start pounding on the ceiling to get him to stop playing music. So he realized, I need to find, he was originally looking for a duplex, and then he found this house. And you can see this interior, the interior of the house in this interview of him. The 49th Street house is part of Turtle Bay Gardens, a group of 24 row houses that share a community garden in the middle of the block. A fun fact, Katharine Hepburn was Sondheim's neighbor, direct neighbor, for over 30 years. Sondheim mentioned that he would sometimes sit on the terrace in the community garden area and write, and that he wrote most of the music and lyrics for Sunday in the Park with George here. That musical premiered at the Booth Theater and went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for drama. While we're working on adding his house to the website, we do have theater sites such as the Martin Beck Theater, again, now the Hirschfeld Theater, where Into the Woods premiered and earned Sondheim a Tony Award for Best Original Score. And the Schubert Theater, where A Little Night Music premiered, earning Sondheim another Tony for Best Original Score. Many of his other musicals, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Sweeney Todd, Follies, Company, and so on, are included in our Broadway theater entries. The LGBT community has had such an enormous impact on musical theater, and of course, theater as a whole, that for tonight's talk, I'm going to highlight just a few other gay composers who have given us some of the most memorable music and lyrics on Broadway. I've only selected a small number of works for each composer, but if you'd like to know more about their other work, as well as that of other major LGBT composers, directors, choreographers, actors, and so on, you can head to our website, where our co-director, Jay Shockley, has put together an incredible resource, a really incredible resource of the queer history of the 43 Broadway theaters that are still standing. We've gathered them into our Broadway Theater District curated theme, which you see here, which is one of over 30 curated themes on our website. And here you also see all of those theaters on our map, with the ability to click on each pin to learn more about their respective histories. Jay will also be giving a talk on Broadway theaters later this year. So if you haven't already, you can subscribe to our email list to be the first to know about that. This is another feature that not many people know about, so I just wanted to point it out. Just another way to search for your favorite composer, let's say Stephen Sondheim in tribute to the late maestro, or anyone or any group or historic site for that matter, is by using the search bar feature, which is on every page on the website. The red arrow here points to that search bar. You type whatever it is you're looking for, hit enter, and that takes you to, in this case, 18 results, most of those historic sites where Stephen Sondheim is mentioned. So Sondheim was once asked if he ever experienced anti-Semitism in his profession, and he responded, "My God, in the theater, in musicals, name me 3 Gentile composers." Illustrating the profound Jewish influence on the American musical, the interviewer couldn't name one, and Sondheim came back with, and here's your moment to take your guess.
Cole Porter.
There you go. Cole Porter, but then followed by saying his music is actually very Jewish, so Sondheim said. Porter scored many hits for stage and screen, including Broadway musicals, where he was a major presence in the 1930s, and with a career that ran until the 1950s. He wrote the music and lyrics for Panama Hattie, a big hit at the 46th Street Theater, which is now the Richard Rodgers Theater. And he was also the composer for Kiss Me Kate and Can Can at the Schubert. Kiss Me Kate premiered at the New Century Theater, which was demolished. Someone reached out to us saying he was surprised that Cole Porter's residence at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel was not included on our website. And the answer to that is we are working on it. We're a small team, and we have a lot of sites to get through, but we, of course, want that site on the website. Composer John Kander and lyricist Fred Ebb, both gay men, formed the songwriting team Kander and Ebb. They're best known for their stage musicals, including their Tony Award-winning music and lyrics for Cabaret, which premiered at the Broadhurst Theater, and Chicago at the 46th Street Theater, where a later revival was staged, but this time when the theater was known as the Richard Rodgers. Ebb also co-wrote the book with Bob Fosse, and the show is the second longest running production in Broadway history after The Phantom of the Opera. Jerry Hermann, among other scores, wrote the Tony Award-winning music and lyrics for Hello, Dolly, which premiered at the St. James Theater and was at one point Broadway's longest-running musical. He also received a Tony for La Cage aux Folles, which premiered at the Palace Theater. Unfortunately, the exterior of this building is no longer, but we do have the interior still there. La Cage, which was written by Harvey Fierstein, became the first hit Broadway musical that prominently featured a gay relationship. One of the lesser-known aspects of Broadway history that comes to mind when you talk about LGBT-themed shows, like La Cage aux Folles, or A Chorus Line, which premiered at the Schubert, or Rent, which premiered at the Nederlander Theater, is that for a long time, before these shows made it to Broadway, LGBT representation on the stage was, by law, illegal. In 1927, the New York legislature enacted the Wales Padlock Law, which threatened theaters with forced closures if gay and lesbian characters were depicted on stage. Although some productions managed to get around this restriction, the law was in place until 1967. And so over that 40-year period, queer people played a huge part in turning Broadway theater into one of New York City's most important cultural and economic forces. At the same time, they could not write or see representations of themselves on stage. People of color also faced discrimination on stage and had even less opportunities to work on Broadway. And this, of course, extended to queer people of color. I mentioned some of Ethel Waters' Broadway work earlier. Paul Johnson was the first African-American composer to have his work staged on Broadway with the all-Black production of the musical Run, Little Chillin' at the Lyric Theater in 1933. This was also the first African-American folk opera staged on Broadway. Georgette Harvey was a stage and film actress who originated the role of Maria in Porgy and then played Maria again in the George Gershwin folk opera Porgy and Bess, which was performed at the Alvin Theater and is now known as the Neil Simon Theater. She appeared in 25 Broadway productions from the 1920s to the 1940s. I wasn't able to get a photo of Porgy and Bess, but this is a scene from the earlier play, Porgy, and she's in the doorway there. Less is known about her partner, Musso Williams, but she appeared in 13 Broadway productions. Harvey and Williams lived together at the Lafayette Apartments at 320 Manhattan Avenue in Harlem, where they frequently entertained theater notables and leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance, including Ethel Waters, Alberta Hunter, and Jimmy Daniels. And you can see the couple, Harvey and Williams, standing in the back row of that quartet photo. And I just want to thank our advisor, one of our advisors, Eric Washington, for bringing this site to our attention. So now we'll take a look at some of smaller music-related venues. In 1939, Jimmy Daniels opened the popular Harlem supper club, Jimmy Daniels, at 114 West 116th Street. He had briefly pursued a theater career in the late 1920s, but moved away from it because of a lack of opportunity for Black actors. In the 1930s, he gained international fame as a cabaret singer and host at various nightclubs and divided his time between New York and Europe. Daniels most often sang show tunes, including those of gay composers Cole Porter and Lorenz Hart. Jimmy Daniels, the Supper Club, was an instant hit and held about 75 people in the cocktail room and featured 2 grand pianos, and Daniels himself would also perform. His club attracted a long list of Black and white notables, including European royals and nobles, Harlem's high society, as well as many celebrities. Daniels was living at 20 West 125th Street, when he left the club in 1942 to enlist in the Army. And this is another example of an African-American newspaper, in this case, the New York Amsterdam News, that is available for search through the New York Public Library. Daniels had relationships with architect Philip Johnson, filmmaker Kenneth McPherson, and lived on Bank Street in Greenwich Village with fashion designer Rex Madsen in the 1950s. We've actually been trying to find that apartment. We have a student consultant at the library going through phone directories, looking for various people's addresses, and this is one of them that we've been trying to find. So for the entirety of the 1950s, Daniels was famously the lead singer at the Bonsoir nightclub in Greenwich Village and gave his last performance at Carnegie Hall days before his death. When I was putting this presentation together, I noticed that women in music on our website are almost all singers. So if you have suggestions for songwriters, musicians, conductors, please let us know in the chat or by email. The Women's Coffee House at 54 7th Avenue South in Greenwich Village is at least one place where lesbian songwriters performed. The lesbian-owned coffee house operated on the ground floor and garden here from 1974 to 78 and held live entertainment and political gatherings. Singer-songwriter Alex Dobkin, who just passed away last year, began her career in the folk music scene playing out in Greenwich Village coffee houses in the 1960s. Dobkin recorded a number of albums and a songbook, touring throughout the world promoting lesbian culture and community through women's music. This is a flyer of a performance she gave at the Women's Coffee House in 1975 at the left, and then a separate poster for a lesbian artist concert held at the coffee house in 1974. Kay Gardner, a musician and composer who is considered a founding foremother of women's music, also performed at this coffee house. In 1974, she and Dobkin recorded and produced an album with explicitly lesbian feminist lyrics. Gardner once sued an orchestra for sex discrimination after the orchestra's players were asked if they could tolerate a woman as a conductor. So I'm going to finish up this musical tour with the beautiful Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which is the final resting place for at least 4 gay composers and songwriters, as well as a number of other people. You'll see rainbow flags next to each gravesite. One of our favorite activities is giving LGBT tours of Greenwood and also Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, and placing rainbow flags next to each gravesite that we visit. And we'll be scheduling these again this year, so be on the lookout for those. They're a great event, and as you can see, a lot of enthusiasm for this event. So one of the notable LGBT people buried here is 19th century composer and pianist Louis Moreau Gottschalk, who is buried next to this Angel of the Music statue. Leonard Bernstein's gravesite is so popular with visitors that it's noted on Google Maps, so very easy to find in that sense. Composer Fred Ebb of Candor and Ebb is interred in a mausoleum with 2 other gay men, Edwin Aldridge and Martin Cohen, though I don't believe we're sure why the 3 of them are there together. And then Paul Jabara was a Lebanese-American singer, songwriter, and actor who wrote songs for artists such as Donna Summers, including her hit Last Dance in 1978, and Barbra Streisand. He also co-wrote and co-composed the hit song It's Raining Men in 1982 for the Weather Girls. Jabara was also a part of the original Broadway cast of the musical Hair and the original West End cast of Jesus Christ Superstar. He sadly died of AIDS-related causes at the age of 44, but remains a highlight of our Gay Greenwood tour. And so that concludes a little tour of just some of the historic places in the city that illustrate the queer community's contributions to the field of music. We hope you'll join us for future programs, which we're busy planning for 2022. Check out our website, and if you're not already, follow us on social media. So thank you, everybody. And I think we'll now open it to Q&A. And someone asked if we know about the gay bar, the Continental in Harlem, saying that I went there in the mid-1960s. We don't have that one on our master list. We have a whole internal list of sites that we want to add to the website. So that would be a great one to add. I guess we have to see if the building is still there. That's on the website we put buildings that are still standing, but in our internal database we do also track sites that have been demolished so that we can record all of this history.
Do you recall where the Continental was located?
Is I think 125th Street.
So we could definitely look it up. Yeah, I mean, we're going to be embarking on additional research for sites associated with the arts, indigenous peoples, people of color, and more marginalized communities within the LGBT umbrella. I mean, it's quite challenging to identify a number of these sites and the full breadth of contributions.
Yes, we're very excited for the release of the 1950 census.
Somewhere I was discussing this with someone last week.
The 1940 census was the talk of the town 10 years ago. So,
and if anyone has suggestions or specific interests in particular presentations, after looking at our website, we'd more than happily, listen to those suggestions. I love that. That's true, Eric. Eric Smith is mentioning where show tunes are sung. So that would be an interesting way to tie it, Broadway to the bars. Maybe that's a whole different presentation. Or from the bars to Broadway. Either way works.
Or maybe we should have a sing-along.
Right. Unfortunately, Marie's Crisis is still surviving.
So we have another addition for the Women's Coffeehouse to look into. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, Patrick. That's good.
Yes, and if you know of any other LGBT jazz artists that you feel should be included on the website, I think we have like with Billy Strayhorn and Billie Holiday and Aaron Bridgers, but those are main sites. Is there hope for people who can't afford to live in NYC? That's a question for, I don't think.
We should look at the Jane Ballroom because that has various associations with LGBT history. So Hedwig premiered there. There was also a production of Tick, Tick, Boom that I saw there, I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that, with Mario Cantone and his now husband, Jerry Dixon. And just for people's information, we are looking at histories from the 17th century or earlier up to 2000. So we had to pick a drop-off point. So anything related to Broadway or music post 2000, we're not exactly focused on.
I mean, actually, we just had our student consultant find an address for Wendy Carlos. Ken is someone who a transgender composer who worked on The Shining. Yeah, lived on the Upper West Side, so that's a site that will be added to the website. Another music site. Well, it seems like everyone got their fill. Thank you for coming to the program. My email is amanda@nyclgbtsites.org. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to hear from you.